Hey guys, Will here. So today we're taking a look at the MotionHouse MotionGear Haptic 4, which is a motion and haptic system with 3 degrees of freedom. Now this particular motion system piqued my interest because on paper at least, it is quite evenly matched to a lot of other systems which cost quite significantly more than it does. So how does the experience actually stack up in the real world? That's what we're going to be finding out today, so stick around. So as always, before we get started, firstly, a couple of quick housekeeping things just so you have the full context of exactly what we're doing today. So firstly, big thank you to MotionHouse for providing this system for us to check out today. Now, as we always like to do here at Boosted Media, we will be cross-comparing against some other competitor products. So it's important that you guys are aware that every system we'll be referencing today has all been sent to us under the exact same conditions. Now, unfortunately, we don't have an affiliate relationship with MotionHouse, so we don't have a specific affiliate link for this particular product. But if you head over to boostedmedia.net or just head down to the description box below this video, you'll find a massive range of discount codes and affiliate links, which is an awesome way of helping you guys save a little bit of money and help support the channel at the same time. So if you are looking at any sim racing gear, whether it's motion systems or anything else sim related, definitely worth your time to check that out. But as is always the case, no third party has any sort of input whatsoever into anything that we're talking about today. Everything we'll be discussing today is just my own observations and my own opinions of both this product and the products that we'll be comparing it to. So before we hop up out of the rig and take a more detailed look at the hardware side of things, let's just quickly cover off some pricing information. So as is always the case, it is important to do your own research here. Make sure that you're aware of any potential shipping costs, import duties, taxes, and so forth. Particularly with the way the world is at the moment, you do not want to be running into any unexpected costs there. So do your own research there. But the basic price before any shipping or taxes for this guy is $5,240 US. Now, just one thing to be aware of there is if you are in a region like the US that uses 120 volts main supply, you will need to buy a converter. Now, because this system draws a peak of 3,000 watts, you will need a pretty hefty converter, and that could well set you back a couple of $100 on top of the cost of the rig. So just make sure you factor in that as well. Do your own research there too, of course. But yeah, just to give you a couple of points of comparison here, a D-Box G5, and these are only systems that we've reviewed in the past here. There are a lot of other systems on the market too, so you can do your own research and check out some other reviews of those. But just to keep it to the ones that we've tested, D-Box G5 comes in at $7,295 US or thereabouts. There are a couple of deals available from some distributors that include a aluminium profile cockpit in that price. So again, just do your own research there. Qubic Systems QS-220, which was one of my favorites. That does have quite significantly more range of movement than this guy does at 100 millimeters of stroke compared to the 75 that we have on this one. That comes in at $9,000 US, so quite significantly more expensive there. The Qubic Systems QS-210, which we have in our storeroom, but haven't quite yet tested, but I do have high expectations for that guy. That comes in at $6,700 US or thereabouts. The Sigma Integrale DK2, which we were very impressed with, 50 millimeters of stroke on that one, so a little bit less than what we have here, but more than what the D-Box has at 38.1 millimeters. That guy comes in at around about $4,300 US for the 3 degree of freedom version. The DK2 Plus, which was basically like the DK2 but on steroids, also 50 millimeters of stroke. That guy comes in at $7,340 US or thereabouts. And those are all for the 3 degree of freedom versions that have pitch, roll, and heave effects, as well as haptic vibration where relevant as well. So again, you can check out our other reviews of those other systems for more details on those. And I would definitely recommend, if you are looking at forking out this kind of money for a motion system, check out as many reviews as you possibly can, get as many opinions as you can as well, because it is a lot of money to be spending on a sim rig. So with that all said, I gave you the range of travel there, or the stroke, just as a point of quick comparison there. But obviously there are a lot of other factors that go into making a good experience when it comes to a motion system. So let's pop up out of the rig now and I'll take you through some of the features and give you a more detailed look at exactly what you're getting for your money with the Haptic 4. So a quick run through some of the specs and a look at the hardware. First of all, this is the giant control box. I'll put the dimensions of this guy up on the screen for you, but it is a lot larger than what you'll find on most other motion systems these days. D-Box in particular, with their newer G5 motion systems, which we have reviewed previously, I'll link it down below for you. They have the majority of the electronics all housed within each individual actuator's enclosure. They are a little bit larger in footprint on the rig itself, but you don't need to have a big control box like this. The old G3 had something that you could mount up underneath the rig, and other people have their own solutions. You can check out our reviews of the other ones that we've looked at for all the details on that. But this is definitely the largest we've seen. It is going to be too big to fit underneath the rig, so you're going to need to set that off to the side somewhere. Thankfully, the cable cables from each actuator are long enough that you can do that. They're a little bit over 3 meters long each. You've got 2 connections, which are just standard Molex style connectors coming from each one of the actuators, one for power and one for control. But when you consider that most rigs are about 1.5 meters long, it does mean you're only gonna have about 1.5 meters of sort of radius around the rig that you're gonna be able to move this control box around. So just be mindful of that. We'll take a look inside at the guts of that a little bit later on. They do include a nice long USB cable as well. It's just a USB-A to USB-B or a standard sort of printer style cable. And then we get to the actuators themselves. So I'm just gonna pull up some of my cheat notes that I've made here just to run you through some of the key specs. So we've got a 75 millimeter stroke, meaning that the rig can move throughout a total range of movement of 75 millimeters. We talked about some of the comparisons there a little bit earlier on. A maximum speed of 150 millimeters per second in standard motion mode or 100 millimeters per second in rumble mode. Now look, honestly, I didn't feel a massive difference with the levels of motion that I run between the 2 different modes, but just be mindful of that. Some other motion systems, in particular the Qubic systems ones, are rated at 400 millimeters per second, which is 4 times faster. But these felt perfectly fine in terms of their responsiveness, so no complaints there. A maximum frequency in terms of its response for haptics of 400 hertz. We'll get into the specifics of that a little bit later on as well. By comparison, once again, D-Box's haptics are limited to 100 hertz, so it's not going to be able to produce as high frequencies as what this can in terms of haptics. Now, it lists in their spec sheet a maximum user weight of 200 kilograms. Now, I can only assume that that means the total payload weight, so the entire rig, including the wheelbase, pedals, and anything else which is actually bolted on top of the thing and moving around with the thing. So I'm not 100% clear on that, but I can tell you I'm about 95 kilos at the moment, and it certainly didn't seem like it was struggling at all, so that was all fine. So then taking a closer look at the actuators themselves, you can see we've got the rubber feet version, which is basically like a non-captive system. So the foot can kind of move around inside the cup. There is a fixed system available as well, so if you're wanting to actually bolt it to the ground and have it not be able to move around at all, that is an option. Now, in terms of the construction of these, we're not going to pull these down and have a look internally at the mechanism itself. I can tell you that it's perfectly smooth in operation and doesn't require any sort of day-to-day maintenance at all, so no real concerns there at all. The motor itself that sits on top of it is just a standard servo style motor. It's an 80 BSF 750 watt rated servo motor to be exact. You can actually find these exact motors on Alibaba and some other online retailers with the control module included as well. And they actually are relatively cheap, so there certainly is the option to DIY something similar to this, but of course most of the complexity in this kind of thing is down to the software and firmware and the integration side of things. Now, there are some DIY motion systems out there. I would definitely recommend researching those. I haven't actually got any personal experience with them, so I won't discuss those any further, but I wouldn't be doing my due diligence if I didn't at least let you guys know that they exist. So definitely check those out. Now, in terms of mounting to the rig, they do include some nice big chunky mounting brackets, 3 millimeter thick steel here, which is powder coated, and there are holes pre-punched in these mounts to bolt these up to your standard 40 millimeter aluminium profile. So you can see these are pieces of 40 by 160, and we've just got them bolted in from the top and the bottom, but there are also bolt holes in the middle channels as well. So if you've got a piece of 40 by 80 or 40 by 120, you can bolt it up to those as well. So absolutely no issues at all with mounting, very simple to do. Is a little bit tricky with one person because you kind of got to hold things up and hold things aligned, but yeah, no real traps there to speak of whatsoever. One thing just to be mindful of, we'll talk about it a little bit later on in the software, is that they do specify a specific distance that you need to have both longitudinally and laterally for the spacing of the actuators. There's no adjustment in the software to actually account for the exact spacing that you have. And there are a couple of reasons for that. We'll discuss that later on, but just wanted to make sure that you're aware of that so that when you're installing the actuators, you have them spaced out appropriately. So let's quickly have a look inside the control box as well, and then we can move on into the software and setup. So as you can see, there's quite a bit going on in here compared to most of the other motion systems that we've had a look at in the past, but we'll break it down for you, give you a better understanding of everything here. But I mean, look, at the top level, I don't see any cause for concern here. Everything looks to be of high quality. There's no dodgy soldering jobs. Everything is on nice high quality Molex connectors. We've got proper standoffs for all the PCBs, and yeah, no cause for concern here whatsoever. So you've got your main 200 to 240 volts coming in. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you cannot run this directly off a 110 or 120 volt power supply. So if you are running in the US, you will need to plug it in through a power converter. So just be mindful of that. Now, as we mentioned before, each one of the individual servo motors is able to draw up to 750 watts. So combine 4 of those and you've got a total peak power of 3000 watts, which is actually more by 600 watts, not an insignificant amount, than what our 10 amp power supplies here supply on a 240 volt circuit. So 240 volts times amps is watts. 240 volts times 10 amps is 2,400 watts. Now, we didn't have any issues with this popping any breakers here, and we did deliberately sort of try to max out the system by raising it up and down as quickly as we possibly could. Didn't run into any issues, but obviously can't guarantee that you wouldn't. So that's another thing to be aware of there as well. But power comes in, goes into a RMS 2010 noise filter down here, then goes from the noise filter into the contactor. The contactor then feeds into this little breakout PCB down here. I'm going to be very careful not to electrocute myself because I do have power in here. You should not be doing what I'm doing right now and having live power inside a box while it's open. But anyway, power goes into this little distribution here, and then that breaks out into providing power for each one of the individual control modules as we see here. So each one of these boxes is responsible for driving one of the servo motors. And then in addition to that, we've got our logic board over here as well, which is using STM32 processor that you can see just down here. So if we quickly flick the power on, you'll see everything flashes into action here. Each one of these has its own diagnostics and communicates individually with each servo motor. And then the outputs and inputs all come in through here. So we've got our communications back to the logic board. We've got our power inputs. We've got an earth cable here as well. And then we've got our main power outputs from here that go to the motor. And then this is our logic and encoder feedback back into each one of these controllers. So you can see 4 of those, 1 for each actuator. And then all that feeds back to these 2 PCBs here, which are the external connections back to the cables that we looked at earlier. So we've got power and logic for each one of those. You can see we've also got individual chokes up here as well, which are basically acting as noise filters for the drive back to the motor. So you've got the power coming out of each individual control board, and that goes into the filter, and then it goes out of the filter into the power supply for each one of the motors. There is a little cooling fan in there as well, and there are some little ventilation holes on either side to allow air to pass through. But as you can see, each one of these is kind of like a modular sealed unit. So there is some airflow through those, but yeah, it all looks very complicated, but when you break it down, it's relatively simple in its construction. Okay, so time now to take a look at the MH Services software, which is going to be responsible for driving any of the MotionHouse gear that you might have on your rig. Now, I'm going to do things a little bit differently from normal here. I'm going to be taking you through a lot of the elements of the driving experience while we go through the software here, simply because the settings that we're going to see here do have a very profound impact on the driving experience. So don't skip over this section of the video. I know a lot of you guys normally do that. I know software can be a little bit boring to look at, but we are going to be talking a lot about the driving experience as we go through this section of the video. So looking at the software here, you can see across the top, we've got a bunch of tabs here. We've got a tab for motion, which we're going to be spending most of the time today. We've got a tab here for wind, rumble motors, and SLI and so forth. So any of the other MotionHouse peripherals will all be controlled through the software through these tabs as well. So you've probably already picked up on the fact that the software is a little bit overwhelming at first. There is just a lot of stuff that's all kind of thrown in your face. So you are left a little bit on your own trying to figure things out. But you know, once you've spent 20 minutes or so, it does sort of start to fall together. And it actually does make a lot of sense once you kind of get your head around everything. But it certainly does look a little bit Windows 98 at face value. But starting off on the PC tab here, you can see basically a list of all of the supported games. And we'll put a full compatibility chart in our written review of this product as well. So you can jump over, I'll put the link down in the description box below for you guys if you want to check out that full list. But yeah, basically it lists all of the games that are supported here. And you'll notice over on the right-hand side here, we've got a button that says patch. So in the case of some of these titles, you will need to click this button. And basically what happens is it pops up and you can see here a window which basically takes you through the instructions pertaining to that particular title. So there may be individual steps that you need to take to actually get it working with this title, in addition to the patch itself. So it'll often ask you to point it to the directory that the game is installed, and then it'll install whatever code it needs to get things working. There were a few instances where I had to fiddle around a little bit. WRC, for example, which has often given me issues with other bits of hardware as well. A couple of wheelbases I've had to make tweaks. We did have to go in and just modify the code a little bit to get that to work. It took me about 20 minutes or so to figure out on my own because the documentation didn't really explain why it wasn't working. But once we got all up and running, it was absolutely fine, but just not quite as seamless as we've seen with some other motion systems, particularly Next Level Racing and Qubic systems. They use the same software package developed by Motion Systems, and that, in my opinion, is the cleanest and easiest to use at this point in time, at least out of the systems that I've tested. So yeah, you might have to patch a couple of games here, but once you've got it all figured out, you won't ever have to touch this again. So that is PC. Then we click on console. Now this is quite interesting interesting. So there are quite a few console supported titles here as well. And you might be wondering how the heck does that work? So you do still need to have a PC. What it does is it connects through to your console via UDP telemetry over your network. So you can see in the case of GT7 here, you put in the IP address and port of your console, and it'll link in and pull the telemetry over the network. So look, the experience here does vary greatly depending on what telemetry is actually coming out of the game. In terms of latency or lag, it is going to be dependent on your network setup because it is obviously relying on your network infrastructure. So in our case, we had the PS5 Pro and our PC that's running the Motion rig all connected via Cat6 through the same switch and router. So we didn't have any issues really to speak of at all with latency. It wasn't really particularly noticeable, but your experience may vary there depending on your network infrastructure. Particularly if you're in a situation where you have to run wirelessly for some reason, you may find that your experience isn't as good as the experience that we had. So just be mindful of that. There's just too many variables there to really guarantee any particular experience. But that is console. Now there is a SDK available as well through MotionHouse, so you can actually make your own integrations if you wish to as well, which is pretty cool. So we're going to skip over Motion just for now and go across to setting. Now here you'll find a couple of configuration options for ensuring that your telemetry is working correctly, particularly with the F1 titles from Codemasters/EA, as you'll notice just here. So it allows us to set up the port that it's listening to for the telemetry output. We do also have telemetry data forwarding here as well, which is always a good thing to see. If you are using other software like SimHub, for example, that also needs to listen to those telemetry ports, you can end up with conflicts if you've got two pieces of software trying to read the same port at the same time. So what this will allow you to do is to intercept that data on the default port using this software and then relay that data across to a different port, which you can then point SimHub to. And that will effectively allow you to read that telemetry data from multiple software packages simultaneously. So always good to see that option. And we do see that option built into most of the other Motion rigs as well. And then lastly, just down here, we've got our data port setting for a couple of other titles as well. So you can see it is pre-filled. And because I'm running default settings in all the sim racing titles, I didn't have to make any changes here. But of course, again, you may need to. So it's good that they have the option to allow you to do that. So then we have a tab here for telemetry. This is basically just a data view of what is being outputted by the game. And you can see all the various different parameters here for output. We've got an about tab here as well, just some basic information about the software. No need to really go through that. SLI is obviously just talking about the dash. Rumble motors is your settings if you've got their rumble motors installed. Wind for their wind simulation. So that brings us to the motion tab, which is where we make all of our adjustments to exactly how this system feels. So starting off at the top here, you do have the ability to import and export profiles. So there isn't any sort of cloud-based system here, but if you do want to load in a profile that somebody in the community's created, you can do that, or you can share your own and switch between different profiles that you might have set up for different cars and so forth. So you've got a drop down here for all the profiles pertaining to each individual supported game, and then you have your individual profiles for each game under the drop down over here. Underneath that, you've got your motion settings. Obviously, you want to have that enabled to make sure the platform is running. And then you've got a button here which opens up their motion tuning guide. Now, they've actually done a pretty good job here of taking you through all of the individual settings and exactly what they do. Again, it can seem a little bit overwhelming at first, but if you break it down and just sort of take the time to read through this in its entirety and really understand what each setting is doing, it is going to make the overall experience a lot better. So I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time here. You guys can load this page up for yourselves on the MotionHouse website and take a look for yourselves if you're looking at buying one of these things. And I would definitely recommend you do that so you get a good understanding of exactly what this is all about. But yeah, it takes you through all the settings and explains exactly what it all does, so you're much better equipped to make adjustments on your own. So to give you the overview here, we've got a couple of different modes. We've got normal mode, which omits all of the haptic effects and just runs motion. So like simulation of the suspension of the car, movement of the car, and so forth, rather than things like road textures, rumble strips, and so forth. So if you're more of a purist that wants to focus purely on what the car is sort of doing mechanically, then you may prefer this mode. I actually prefer to run the rumble mode with a little bit of those effects, but I do like to be quite selective in which effects I have turned up, because you don't want to get into a scenario where you're just completely overwhelmed with sensory overload, basically, and just, you know, input that's just bombarding you. You want to feel what the car's doing and feel the things that are actually, you know, necessary to drive more quickly and more consistently. But in the normal mode here, we've got a couple of adjustments for smoothness, acceleration, vibration, and maximum speed. So if you want to soften things down a little bit, you can do that here. And then underneath that, we've got individual adjustments for each element of the motion. So with a 3-degree of freedom system like what we have here, we have roll, pitch, and heave. So I'm not sure exactly why sway and surge are enabled here because you can see yaw and suspension grayed out. But roll is going to be your side-to-side movement, pitch is going to be your front-to-back movement, and then heave is going to be lifting up and down. So you can see at the moment I'm running all three of these at 25% of their capacity, and that is more than enough for me. You know, it is going to be a subjective thing, but as you guys have heard me say in a lot of my motion system reviews, for me at least, I find that less is more. If it's really sort of throwing you around to the point where, you know, you just don't have any finesse in your inputs because you're having to make explosive muscle inputs to overcome the motion of the rig, then, you know, even though it might feel a little bit more immersive and realistic, you're not going to be as fast or consistent if you're just being thrown all over the place. So definitely worth your time to experiment with this and find where the sweet spot is for you. Not necessarily going to be exactly where it is for me. But just to give you a quick idea here before we jump into rumble mode, I'm going to jump over onto the test tab quickly. I'm going to put my feet up on the platform so I don't break my leg. We're going to enable the motion test here. And if we see the system's going to activate, hopefully my head hasn't gone out of the frame there. And then if we do the roll effect, we can roll it over to the side and you can see how violent that is. Roll it over from side to side. So it does have a pretty extreme range of movement there from side to side. Now, because the actuators are further apart front to back than they are from side to side, you're not going to have quite as extreme a range of movement in the pitch axis. So if we go forward, you can see it's lifting me forward like that. And then back. It is quite notchy in this adjustment here, but it is smooth when you're driving, of course, so that's not a problem. But you can see all the way back there, looks like that. And if we return it to center, whoop, there we go. And then for heave, you can see the whole rig is going to lift up and go down. So that is the range of movement that we have available there. And you can see as I raise it up and down. So I'm going to just disable that again quickly now, and we'll go back to the motion tab. So rumble mode is where most people are going to be spending most of their time, I think at least, because you can dial in and dial out the individual effects to really sort of suit your preference. Now, they've made quite a big deal in their marketing about the ability to generate haptic effects through these actuators, which theoretically at least means that you don't need to run anything like a butt kick or any sort of vibration transducer on the rig. The motion system itself is capable of producing all those effects. Now, those of you who've been watching the channel for a while would know that I run a D-Box G3 system on my daily driver rig, and that also has a lot of haptic effects built into it as well. The main difference here being that this system is able to produce haptic effects all the way up to 400 Hertz, whereas the D-Box G3 system is only able to produce those effects up to about 100 Hertz. Now, what we have over in the test tab, again, just quickly to give you a bit of a real world example of this, is a rumble test. So if we click this on, what it's going to do is it's going to initialize like this, and then it's going to run through RPM, so that's like engine vibration, and you should be able to hear that on the microphone. Then we go through the roll test, pitch, heave, and then we're going to get the rumble. So it's basically just a frequency sweep from 30 Hertz all the way up to 400 Hertz and then back down again. Okay, so the reason I wanted to run through that is to sort of give you a bit better of an idea of exactly what that frequency range means in terms of what you're feeling in the rig. So I can tell you that anything over about 100, maybe 150 Hertz starts to get into the range where you're hearing it more than you're actually feeling it. So those vibrations are so fine that they don't really have a profound effect on what you're experiencing inside the rig, but they do obviously produce a lot of noise, as you could hear through the microphone. So I didn't find the haptic effects on this to be profoundly more detailed or better than any other system that I've tested before, including the D-Boxes, which only go up to 100 Hertz. It does mean that it's able to produce things like harmonics at those higher frequencies, but it certainly wasn't anything that felt particularly profound or game-changing to me compared to those other systems that do similar things within within various different frequency ranges. Now, for those of you who are more technically minded, the reason for that is because the frequency response isn't completely linear. So just like a pair of headphones or a speaker, anything like that, the amplitude that's required to produce the same perceived energy level will vary depending on the frequency. So let's go back to the motion tab again now and quickly run through these various different settings here. So under overall performance here, we've got an adjustment for speed, which is basically how reactive or how quickly the system accelerates. You can see this by default with this particular profile was set to 80. So if you're feeling like you want it to be a little bit quicker or a little bit more responsive, you can crank that up. Of course, when I was doing my testing, I did experiment throughout the entire range here. And I did find that it was certainly reactive enough for me. I didn't find that it felt laggy or like it wasn't quite able to keep up with what the car was doing at all, even at these lower levels. So I would say the acceleration level that we have here is more than sufficient, even though the acceleration isn't as high as what we see with some other motion systems like the Qubic systems, for example, which go all the way up to 400 millimeters per second. So then we move down to engine RPM, pretty self-explanatory here. This is basically just going to be a vibration that you feel through your rig, increasing and decreasing with the RPM of the car. So we've got sliders here to set your minimum and maximum RPM, or you can actually set minimum and maximum based off the telemetry coming out of the game. So you can basically just have the car idling, set your minimum, rev the car to the maximum, and set maximum depending on the car that you're driving. So that's quite a cool little feature there. Now, one thing that I want you to understand, and we'll see it a little bit more as we go through this, but most of these effects are actually being generated by the telemetry itself rather than being pre-recorded or canned effects, as they're often described as, which are basically just like, if this is happening, then play this effect, which obviously isn't as authentic, but not every sim is able to produce every single effect through telemetry. So having a mixture, I think, is actually a good thing. And if you've seen my reviews of the Sigma Integrale systems, for example, they take a very purist approach to this. And what that means is that, to use iRacing for an example, if you drive on some circuits, you'll find that there's just no sensation at all of the vibration as you drive over a rumble strip, only the suspension movement, whereas other rumble strips on other tracks, you may not have that problem. So it tends to be a little bit less consistent if you're relying purely on telemetry generated effects, although that is the more pure way of doing it. So it just comes down to subjective preference there. But I think what they've done here is actually quite good in having a mixture of both, so you kind of get the best of both worlds. So then moving down here, you can see we've got options for enabling harmonics. So without going into a ton of detail here, these are basically just ways to fine tune that experience even more. And if we click on the setting button here, you can see there's actually the ability to adjust the harmonic frequencies via nodes like what we see here. So you really can get in here and fine tune it at a very granular level to feel exactly the way you want it to feel. So again, I would suggest spending some time in here going through this and really tweaking it to find the exact sweet spot for the car that you're driving. And yeah, I think it works really well, but so obviously it is still limited by what we were talking about before. So because that frequency response in the actuators isn't completely linear, you will find that you need to tune around that a little bit more than what you might find with a vibration transducer, which is more sort of purpose designed for this kind of thing. So I'm not necessarily saying that this isn't as good as vibration transducers, but you may just find that there are some limitations there. We've got a visualizer here for the telemetry coming out of the game as well, if you want to make use of that. And then we also have a tab here for aircraft engines as well. So that allows you to assign an engine number. So obviously aircraft have more than one engine in many cases. So you can assign each engine to a specific actuator on the rig. At least that's my understanding. I haven't actually tested this thing in flight simulation, but we may end up doing that as a separate video a little bit later on if you guys are interested in that. So let us know in the comments down below. And then you've got an effect balance here as well. So you're able to adjust the bias of the effect front to rear here, should you wish to do so. So that is our engine vibration. We then move down to gear shift. Now, this is one of my favorite effects, whether you're talking about haptics or motion systems. I always love to have this on and cranked up a little bit. You can see by default, it's actually switched off with this particular profile, but I would definitely recommend switching this guy on. And I actually like to run it cranked up all the way to the maximum. What this is effectively going to do is just send a jolt through the rig every time you change gear, as you can see in this driving footage now. So this is where we start to get into the differences between telemetry-based effect and canned effects or processed effects. So with the gear shift and the rumble strip effect that we'll get into in just a moment, you'll notice two things. There's a waveform here, so you can use either a sine wave, which is more smooth, or a square wave, which is more rippled. So that's just a subjective preference thing. I actually prefer the sine wave, but we've got a little button here for settings as well. And you can see this allows us to manually adjust the frequency of the effect, the amplitude of the effect, the start delay, and the duration of the effect as well. So this is what I mean by a canned effect. What we're able to do here is actually dial in the effect to feel exactly the way we want it to feel, rather than it being something that's actually produced by the telemetry itself. So in the scenario of a gear shift, in most cases at least, there's not really any telemetry-based data coming out of the game that is allowing the motion system to really do much. All it knows is that a gear has been changed. If there is a little bit of a movement in the suspension of the car, telemetry based out of the game, then we could potentially make use of that. But I think going back to that best of both worlds kind of approach here, I think this is a really smart way of doing it. Just the same with rumble strip as well. Again, I don't know why this is switched off by default in their profile, because straight away I noticed that, like I was saying before, in iRacing, some of the rumble strips where there was actually telemetry based data for them, you could feel it through the suspension of the car, but a lot of the rumble strips, you would just simply feel the sensation of the car kind of going up on its side, or, you know, bumping up, the suspension bumping up over that ripple strip, whereas you wouldn't actually feel the texture of what was underneath you. So switching that guy on, and again, going into the settings here, you're able to fine tune at a very granular level based off nodes at different frequencies, the amplitude at each frequency range to really dial this in to feel exactly the way you like. So again, really, really like what they've done here. It really does allow you to dial this in to feel exactly the way you like. So there's two options here, side sync and all sync. From what I understand, side sync is basically just separating each side. So you got your left side and your right side, whereas all sync simulates each individual tire and its interface with the road. That's my understanding at least. Anyway, and again, we've got the option here for square or sine wave, depending on what you prefer. So then we get down into wheel slip, which again, we're back into telemetry-based effects here. And again, you've got an amplitude adjustment here, so you can tweak that to your heart's content. Again, it was switched off by default, which I'm not 100% sure the reason why, but you can see our telemetry input here for each of the individual four wheels. So I'll just drag those in quickly. You can actually see the telemetry for each wheel. You can see slip ratio, front right, front left, rear right, and rear left. So you can actually see exactly what's coming out of the game as you're driving if you're wanting to make fine tuning adjustments there. And again, you've got that node based adjustment, so you can fine tune and dial this in to exactly the way you like it to feel. So while the wheel slip effect doesn't necessarily feel particularly realistic, like a car actually sliding on a real road, what it does allow you to do is actually feel with your body when the car is starting to lock up and slip along the road. So a lot of people I know like to turn up the audio tire effect just so they can hear exactly what the tires are doing underneath them. This is kind of like another layer on top of that to allow you to actually feel that a little bit more profoundly. So again, it's not necessarily about trying to make it feel as realistic as possible. It's more about trying to give your brain the cues it needs through physical movement and sensation to allow you to get a better sensation of what the car is doing underneath you. So again, same kind of adjustments as we saw before there. And then likewise with lateral slip as well, this is going to allow you to feel the slip angle of the car. And again, it is telemetry based, so you can make adjustments based off the telemetry data, just the same as what we saw before. And then we get down into our brake input. So this is going to allow the rig to move around or give the sensation of braking input. Now, again, I like to run this turned on but turned down quite a lot. Again, exactly where is going to depend on your personal preference, so I would recommend playing around with this. But look, this does give you a good sensation of when you're braking, the rig sort of lifting up a little bit. It gives you a little bit more feeling of exactly what's going on in the car. But look, it is going to be a balance here because a lot of this is sort of simulated through the suspension movement naturally through the telemetry anyway, so it is going to be a bit of a balancing act here to figure out exactly where you like to have this set. But there is plenty of adjustment here once again to get this dialed into exactly the way you like. ABS as well, so this is going back into processed effects or canned effects. So you can see we've got a setting here for our frequency, amplitude, start, delay, and duration or period. So that is going to allow you to feel a sensation based off what you set here every single time the ABS kicks in. So again, it's just about getting more connected to the car and feeling what's going on with the car rather than just hearing it or having a light flashing in your face. And then we get down into our motion adjustments, which are basically exactly the same as what we saw before. So we've got our adjustments for roll, pitch, and heave. And we also do have a little button here for expert adjustments as well. So this is going to be beyond the scope of today's video, but if you want to get in here and really fine tune stuff, again, you do have the option. We've got a whole bunch of filters here, actuator ranges and so forth. So if you want to make adjustments for the placement of the actuators, remember what we were saying before about the distance from side to side being different from the distance front to back. So the movement from side to side does tend to be a little bit more profound than front to back because of that. So you can account for that here as well. One interesting thing is I noticed in the instructions, it does actually give you a measurement that it wants you to use for the spacing of the actuators, rather than like what you see with a lot of other motion systems where you can kind of put the actuators wherever you want and then just put in the numbers. The downside of doing it that way, of course, is that, you know, if you have the actuators way outside of their optimal range, you might not necessarily realize it, but you are actually potentially restricting the movement quite a lot by doing that. So yeah, just one thing that I thought was quite interesting. But if you are wanting to understand more details on this, again, have a look at their motion guide, and it will take you through exactly what all of this stuff does. So that is an overview of all the things you have available to you here in the MH Services software. Let's talk a little bit more now about the overall driving experience, what this is like compared to some other motion systems that we tested in the past, and wrap things up with our conclusions. Okay, so I've been driving with and living with this thing in general now for a good number of weeks. What are my overall impressions? Now, look, I'll be completely honest with you. I didn't have particularly high expectations going into this review. When they got in touch with me and asked me if I'd be interested in reviewing the thing, you know, I did what I always do. I have a look at their website, have a look at their marketing, and I just wasn't left with an overall high perception of quality or expertise in the field, I guess you could say, compared to other competitors, which obviously put a lot more effort into those kinds of elements of their business. And, you know, that doesn't necessarily indicate a good or bad product, but it just kind of set me up with a certain expectation. And then, you know, when we unboxed everything, took the big control box out of the package in particular, again, I was kind of thinking, oh, you know, this is, you know, massive, and this is going to be something that's kind of bootleg. And even though the actual mechanical build quality of the stuff is absolutely fine, again, I just kind of I was left with that impression. Then we got everything fired up, and I remember I said to Tom, you know, this is probably going to take me a day just to get this thing working. And, you know, we installed the software. It did take me a little bit of effort to get the software installed. You know, I had trouble finding the link on the website. But once we installed the software, it just worked. You know, as I said in the software section before, the default profiles weren't particularly good. There definitely needs to be a little bit of work done there, I think. But once I got things dialed in, there's actually an awful lot of potential here that I was able to unlock, and it actually ended up being a pretty darn awesome product, particularly for the price compared to a lot of the other stuff that's out there. So yeah, look, I mean, to summarize the experience overall, yeah, it's been a good experience across the board. Pretty much everything that we've thrown at it, including, you know, testing across consoles, testing in a variety of different sim racing titles, more general gaming as well. So we tried some of the Simcade style titles like F1, for example. And look, it performed on par with other systems that cost as much or more than what this does. And I think, you know, a couple of the things that stood out to me in particular were just how smooth and responsive the system was overall. It is relatively quiet as well, provided that you've got those haptics turned down. Now, any system that is producing high frequency haptics is always going to generate noise. So when you hear me say that the effects are noisy, that is not a criticism of this product. Any product, whether it be a butt kicker or a vibration cushion or some sort of vibration system on your rig, they're all going to make noise if they're operating in high frequency, and that goes for the wheelbases as well that we have these days with those high frequency haptics built in. So certainly not a criticism of the product. There was no issues with lag or latency. Everything was perfectly responsive. Nice smooth feeling as well. One of the things I thought might happen is I thought it might have quite a robotic kind of feeling to it. I thought it might be, kind of jerky and, just not feel particularly refined to drive with, but that wasn't the case at all. It was perfectly smooth, every bit as smooth as any one of the other systems that I've driven with that, again, cost a lot more than what this does. And I think the real thing that surprised me was, again, firing up the software, as you guys saw, it doesn't look particularly attractive. It does look a little bit thrown together, but all the stuff that you need is all there. And I think they've actually done a really good job of providing a software package that gives you the basics, but also allows you to unpack that a little bit further should you wish to do so. This is one of the things we were discussing with the VRS wheelbase review that we did just recently, was that, it was well presented and, easy to get your head around, but I wished that you could sort of drill in further into advanced settings and unlock some of those filters and really tweak stuff. And I think that's pretty much what they've nailed here. You can get in and do that stuff if you really wish to, but for those who are just getting started or maybe feel a little bit overwhelmed by those advanced settings, there's enough there to get you a good experience without being completely overwhelmed. And of course, you do have the ability to import and share profiles, offline as well. So that was a good thing. Now, one thing that you may have noticed is missing from the software is any sort of motion compensation for either fixed screens or VR. Now, if you've got your screens mounted to your rig and everything's moving together in unison, obviously this isn't going to be a consideration. But if you are running fixed screens, Look, in my experience, again, at the motion levels that I like to run, I haven't found motion compensation on fixed screens to be necessary. The reason why you might want to have that is, if you feel a sensation of kind of floating around in the cockpit because, your perspective in the cockpit is fixed, but the rig is moving around all over the place, it can be, quite motion sickness inducing, but, it can create a sensation of disconnect between you and the car. So, the motion levels that I run, I'm not moving around all that much anyway, and I haven't really found it to be an issue, particularly if you have the car set up so that, the camera isn't fixed and it's kind of moving around a little bit as well. So I don't find the lack of motion compensation for screens to necessarily be a massive detractor here. But again, if you're running a huge amount of motion here, if you're really wanting to be thrown around, you may disagree with me on that. So that is one thing to consider, particularly if you're doing a lot of rally and off-road style driving, particularly off-road trucks or rallycross things going over big jumps. You may well feel quite differently to me about that. VR, on the other hand, I would be lying if I didn't say that I missed it. Coming from my giant Qubic Systems motion rig that I use for VR regularly, I did find that I had a sensation of just kind of floating around in the cockpit, and I did feel quite disconnected at times, even at the low motion levels that I like to run. So if you are somebody that races primarily in VR, I would say that that is definitely a consideration. Now, there are third-party software packages that do incorporate that functionality into your sim rig, so you don't necessarily have to buy a motion system that has that built in, but definitely something that is worth considering. I haven't tried any of those third-party solutions, so I can't really comment on them, but yeah, definitely if you're wanting to drive primarily in VR, that is definitely one element that I would consider. So just going through my other notes here in terms of some of my observations. As I mentioned, I did feel that the default profiles for most of the games weren't particularly good, particularly in the haptic mode. A lot of those settings were switched off by default, and yeah, I just felt like there was a lot of potential there that needed to be unlocked by spending a bit of time there. So I wouldn't say that this is a product that you're just gonna, plug in, fire up, and get the best experience. It is definitely gonna be worth your time if you do buy one of these things, spending a good couple of days really fine-tuning it and getting it to feel exactly the way you like, and just experimenting with different things, because what you think is going to be right for you may not necessarily actually end up being exactly what you like, and it is all very, very subjective. What I'm looking for when I review one of these types of things is its ability to provide a wide spectrum of different types of effects and things that you might want to feel when you're driving, rather than sort of pointing towards something that is just suited to what I personally like subjectively. So we talked a little bit at the start of the video about movement range. We'll just make a couple more comparisons in terms of the driving experience here. So this guy has a movement range of, or a stroke of 75 millimeters. Comparing that to some of the other options on the market, the D-Box G5 is 38.1 millimeters total stroke. And as I mentioned earlier, I actually run the D-Box G3 on my daily driver rig, which has the same amount of stroke or very close to it. And that is absolutely fine for me under most scenarios. There are a couple of other systems that I've personally tested, and I'm only going to talk about things that I have personal experience with here. Of course, there are other systems out there too, and it's always valuable for you guys who have experience with those to chime in the comments down below. Let us know what you think of those and how your observations of those compare to my observations of some of these ones. But we've got things like the Sigma Integrale DK2, which has 50 mil of stroke, the DK2 Plus, which is more aggressive but also has 50 mil of stroke. So this does have more stroke or more movement range than any of those systems do. We have also got experience with the Qubic Systems QS-220, which has 100 mil of stroke, and that is significantly more expensive than this is. But for me, I spend most of my time road racing or road driving. I'm not spending a lot of time in the dirt, and I just don't find that I need a lot of range of movement. As I was saying earlier on when we were looking at the software, there is a point where, and the point's going to be different for everybody, but there is a point where you're getting thrown around so much that you're having to start making explosive muscle movements to control the car, because you're just being thrown around so much. And that's the point where you're going to start to have less finesse in your inputs. You're not going to be as quick and consistent. So, if you're the sort of person that's looking for maximum immersion and you want to be really thrown around, then yeah, you may lean towards something that has a little bit more movement range. But, if you're somebody that's wanting to have a refined experience, somebody that's wanting to, drive as quickly and consistently as possible, and is willing to sacrifice some of that immersion to have that consistency, then yeah, I think you're going to be like me and, be absolutely fine with less movement range. So what you need to think about here is, if the rig is moving around, say for example, you're coming over the crest of a hill, you might find that as you get to the crest of the hill, the motion platform uses the heave to sort of, simulate that sensation of kind of coming up over the hill. but then you hit somebody or you hit a wall or something, and suddenly the rig's got to move even more than what it already had. If you're on a motion platform that's maxing out just simulating that heave movement as you crest the hill, then you don't have any scope left to produce that effect of, you know, an impact or something like that. And we actually encountered a good example of this while we were testing this rig. One of the things that I specifically tested for was to see what would happen if you did max out the range of movement. And yeah, we found exactly that. When we were bumping around and doing other things, it basically just was clipping all of those signals. It wasn't doing anything. So you lost all of that sensation of movement. So once we cranked those undulation effects back down again, it unlocked the ability to do both at the same time. So more range of movement is going to allow more freedom in that regard. Whether or not you actually use that range of movement is going to be up to you. But for me, I'm able to get things dialed in to the extent that I like them with a far less scope of movement than what we have with this particular rig, but not everybody is going to be exactly the same as me. So yeah, unfortunately I can't really say what the sweet spot is there, but I feel like for road racing at least, you don't really need more than a couple of inches or, you know, 40 mil somewhere thereabouts is going to be absolutely fine. So yeah, not necessarily a massive selling point with this particular rig, but again, all other things being very good, I think it is good that, you know, for the price point, you do have a decent range of movement here compared to something like a D-Box, for example, which is a lot more expensive and you know, doesn't have the same scope of movement as what this does. So just a couple of other quick notes here as well. They've made a big point about the haptic effects being capable of going all the way up to 400 Hertz. And again, just to reiterate, as I said in the software section of the video, for me at least, anything over about 150 Hertz, you start to get into the range where all you're really doing is just hearing the vibration, rather than actually feeling anything. You know, as we saw in the frequency sweep before, you could hear things sort of rattling around at lower frequencies, and then as it gets that higher frequency, you know, it just becomes more like a resonance throughout the rig rather than something that you physically feel in your body. Now, of course, there are harmonics and things like that, and you know, being able to produce those higher frequencies does unlock the ability to produce some of those effects. But whether you're going to notice that kind of thing with everything else that's going on in the rig, for me, I can tell you that I didn't really notice it at all. So, you know, I can't speak for everybody there, but I didn't find that anything over about 150 Hertz was particularly useful. And I actually would say that compared to the haptic feedback that I get on my daily driver D-Box system, I feel like that is maybe a little bit more linear than what this is. You remember when we were in the software section before, we were talking about the linearity of that haptic feedback and how as the frequency increases, the sensation that you feel, you know, sort of tapers off and, you know, comes off the bell curve. I felt like the roll-off was a little bit more aggressive here. The power behind those vibrations did diminish more quickly as we got up towards those higher frequencies, even compared to something like the D-Box, which actually advertises a lower frequency response. So yeah, that was a little bit interesting. But again, not necessarily a major complaint by any means, but just one little observation that I did have compared to some of the other systems that we've tested with. And look, other than that, it really does just come down to practicality type stuff. You know, a lot of other motion systems we see on the market, particularly D-Box, do a better job of, you know, having a small integrated electronics that don't require you to have a big bulky control box next to you. You know, you do have enough length in the cables here that you can set that off to the side behind a curtain or something like that. But I think most people, if given the option, would go for a smaller control box that they can just tuck underneath the rig and have it completely out of the way, not taking up any additional space. So yeah, I would like to see them shrink that down a little bit, make it a little bit more compact. And really just the other major consideration there as well is that additional cost that we mentioned at the start around voltage converters. So if you aren't living in an area with 220 to 240 volt mains power, you are going to need a converter, and that could potentially be quite expensive considering that this thing requires 3000 watts at peak. So yeah, just consider that as well. But yeah, look, overall, I've got to say that this product has exceeded my expectations. As I said to you going into this, my expectations weren't particularly high, but I do think that for the money, they've done a really good job here. You know, I would say that it performs on par with, if not maybe even slightly above, some other alternatives that do cost significantly more than this does. So for that reason, I think that it is good value. I feel like motion in general is prohibitively expensive, and I hope that it is a technology that we see come down in price over time. I do feel like at the moment, out of the systems that we've personally tested here at Boosted Media, Sigma Integrale probably do have the best value for money motion, but there are a lot of DIY solutions out there as well that I know can save you a lot more money, and a lot of people speak very highly. Unfortunately, I don't have experience with those, so I can't speak to them. But yeah, this, for what it is, I think is very good. And if you're lucky enough to be in a position to be able to buy one of these, I certainly don't think you're going to be disappointed. And it's as simple as that, guys. So thank you very much for watching. Really hope today's video has helped you out. If it has, please do leave a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to the channel as well so you don't miss out on future reviews, as well as our review of that QS-220, which we do have in the storeroom. We are going to be getting to that as soon as we possibly can. And I feel like even though that one is a little bit more expensive, given our experience with the QS-220, which I was very impressed with, I do have very high expectations for the 210. So we'll certainly see how that goes. But yeah, I think that's it for today's video. So thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.